Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of the Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, and the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field. Then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy. Hey there, thanks for joining us for another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture podcast. It's me, your host, Damian Mason. You knew that, but you know what? I've got my co-host of the Business of Ag Success Group, Todd Thurman, joining me, and we're talking about the future of ag is de-globalized. That's right. I've been talking a lot on the winter speaking circuit about the Asians of agriculture, and one of the big ones is de-globalization. Every person listening to this right now, it doesn't matter whether you are a freshman in college or you are 70 years old, you've only known one thing: a globalized agricultural system, because it was pretty much the thing post-World War II. After World War II, you got the Marshall Plan rebuilding Europe, you got Japan that's pretty well decimated, the United States was intact, and we also had the agricultural technology and the manufacturing infrastructure to be a world player. Then we said, man, we're so good at making stuff. Let's figure out a way to make stuff and send it somewhere else. Then manufacturing started going overseas, largely in the 1980s. And then we said, yeah, but there's one thing we're still really good at manufacturing, and that is crops. So we started saying, let's just keep making crops and finding somewhere to go with it. And you know what? Those pesky crop inputs, things like chemicals, they're nasty. Let's not make those here in the U.S. Let's put those in China. Some of us are old enough to remember Union Carbide, one of the precursors to the modern chemical companies, had a huge facility in India, had a big explosion over there, in fact, in the 1980s. Anyway, I'm giving you some history, and I'm giving you some future, and I'm going to bring it from my perspective, and I'm going to certainly lean on my international cohort, Todd Thurman, who worked in in Russia, and also in China. The guy is going to give you his perspective. I'm telling you, if you think the future of American agriculture is just like it used to be, make more stuff, find a barge to put it on, and find some country that will take it, it's not going to be that way. Todd Thurman, before we hit record, I said, all right, we're going to be throwing this out there. The future of ag is de-globalized. Am I right? Are we right? And why are we?
Yes, I think you're right. I think it is de-globalized. I think it's difficult to see these types of transitions when you're right in the middle of them, and that is absent strange confounders. And we certainly have not had any shortage of those confounders in terms of the financial crisis back in 2008, and then obviously recently the pandemic. So it's very difficult to see these types of trends as they're occurring, as you kind of reach that tipping point. I think that's where we're at, and I think that's why you have quite a bit of disagreement on whether or not this is going to happen. But to me, it is clear that all of the trends are moving in a more de-globalized direction.
Okay, you said
whether that's...
You just said it's difficult to see them when you're in the middle of it. I'm going to say, nope, not in the middle, not even in the first quarter. I'd say we're just after kickoff. I'd say that because everybody's, as you said before we hit record, oh, well, this is just a function of distorted world markets after the shutdowns, after the pandemic. You know, we were paying $40,000 for a container from China, and now it's down to $4,000 or whatever. It's like less than a tenth of what it was just 2 years ago. People are saying, no, this is all just distortion. It's not real. And I'm saying, no, it kind of was coming anyhow. You have, I would say famously, but you're only famous in my head. You have famously said, Todd, the pandemic did not create some of these situations, it accelerated or accentuated these situations. We were moving into a more deglobalized world as it was. And then the whole 2020 shutdowns. And my most recent episode was me talking about China, why China's bad for ag, why China's it's been very good for ag, and China's been very good for the lower end consumer that goes to Walmart and buys cheap manufactured goods. But in general, there was going to be a United States and China, shall we say, pissing match getting worse. And we're kind of there. I'd say that what we saw in the last couple of years just really threw gas on the fire that was the realities that would probably push for some deglobalization.
No, I think that's true. And I think if you go back to, look at this current wave of globalization that, we're in right now, and you and I think we're transitioning out of. I mean, it really started, as you mentioned, in post-World War II. You had a situation where, the global world order sort of shifted to be more of a U.S.-led world order that was focused very much on developing global trade. That really accelerated again in sort of this second wave that occurred in the 1980s and 90s when the Cold War ended, and we started bringing in some of these emerging economies into the fold as well. So it was, in the post-World War II, between then and the end of the Cold War, it was more about the traditional Western powers kind of getting together and creating an environment where we could trade with one another effectively and safely. And then it really accelerated when we rolled in some of these emerging economies in the 80s and 90s, like most notably China, but also India, Brazil, and a lot of the African nations. So, that really accelerated in the late 1980s, early 1990s. Actually, and that's what we're seeing now.
From a standpoint of history, when you think about it, first off, it's nothing new. I think that we have a thing where, okay, let's say you're 20, 40, 60 years old. It don't matter. You think that what you're seeing now is something that's had no historic precedence. And God knows the word during the pandemic between flatten the curves and unprecedented, I'm so tired of it. But the reality is this is not unprecedented. Let me just give you a couple of thoughts on this. The United States was a territory. The United States was a colony. The United States was a colony of which the resources were exclusively meant to be extracted. And then textile mills came to the Carolinas from Europe because we had cotton and we had resources and we had humans that would cheaply do the labor. This idea of setting up manufacturing in another country that is lesser developed than you for a cheap extraction of goods is not new. We were it. We were the emerging market of the time. And so it kind of really got it. Like I said, the 50s, we had all of our resources intact post World War II. We had this baby boom going on. It was like, man, sky's the limit. And so then it became, we manufactured stuff and we manufactured a lot of food and sent it overseas. Really, we didn't become an export market until somewhere in the 50s, right? We didn't really grow soybeans in the United States of any consequence until post World War II. And so then it became, we've made all this shit. Where do we go with it? And that's kind of been the mindset. You were born in the 70s. I was born in the 60s. That was the mindset 10 and 20 years before we were even born. And it's really maintained that mindset. And I'm telling you, I've been saying for a long while, that mindset's got to change.
Well, and the only unique thing about what has happened in this most recent wave of globalization is that it has happened is the way it's happened. And it's been not a colonial process, right? So when you go back and in the past, world powers have been exploiting the resources, whether they're human resources or natural resources of the quote unquote developing world for, a millennia. This is certainly nothing new. What's new is that it was no longer, since World War II, has not been a colonializing process. Right. So we are trading freely with those different countries and not taking over those countries and exploiting their resources. So it's been more of a mutually beneficial arrangement. And that's why we've seen such a huge growth in the economy, the global economy as a result.
And by the way, the globalists, this is an interesting thing. If you pay attention to conservative media or maybe stuff on social media that's not censored as much, the more conservative crowd might say, call the globalists. But there is some reality to this. Who it's been very good for. Who has the globalization been really good for? Well, let's face it, Brazil. Brazil is in the last, when I was a kid, people talked about going to Brazil and buying acres for like $14 an acre and this kind of thing. Brazil is a world power, not a world power. Brazil is a world powerhouse in terms of agricultural production. That's because of globalization. India is now on the radar. They've always been a country with a boatload of people. It was the economic trade that made their boatload of people maybe an asset versus a liability. Who's it been good for? The American consumer. I made this point. We have one of those little electric griddles you plug in. When I was a kid, the neighbor, doctors, they had money. They had an electric griddle. And I'm like, only rich people have this. My mom has to use a skillet. I went to the store 3 years ago for Lori's birthday, bought her an electric griddle, which I know is not very romantic. But anyway, I said, these are cheaper now than they were in 1975. The American consumer is a winner of the globalization. Cheap stuff, very cheap stuff. However, it can't keep up, is my assertion, because we're going to run out of markets and there's going to be this, shall I say, the elephant in the room, the reality that China wants to upend this happy little globalized world.
Well, and it's terribly ironic because, I would argue that certainly Brazil and India are among the countries that have benefited the most from the current situation, from the post-World War II environment, from globalization. But clearly, China is by far the biggest beneficiary of globalization, and they are not only, like you might expect, trying to hold on to globalization like grim death, which they should be. They're actually one of the catalysts for deglobalization. I think it's a very short-sighted approach from their perspective. Economically, it may be a political necessity, but I think what you're seeing in China is a behavior that is economically completely irrational and only makes sense in a political context. And that's if you're doing nothing but trying to retain power. So it's really quite ironic. And I think history is going to look back on this transition and think, what a huge bungle from a geopolitical perspective. This may be changing even if China was trying to hold on to this like grim death. But with China pretty much embracing the idea of deglobalization, it seems inevitable, and I don't see any indication that trend's going to be changing. Yeah,
and by the way, you might be saying, Damian and Todd, this is crazy. It's not really. This is not happening. We're not bringing all the factories back home, because that's when we talk about deglobalization. We're saying, what's that look like, and that's what we're going to go next. But first off, we're not saying that it's happening in one fell swoop. Headline in Wall Street this week said that Volkswagen is going to spend $200 billion on their global initiative, the bulk of which is in China, to go and sell. That's because they want to sell cars to China. And so they want to sell cars in China to China. It does not mean that they're all about making it a more globalized. Those companies, yes, are saying globalization is good for Volkswagen. But let's look at the realities here. Let's go back to the business of agriculture. I just pulled some numbers for the fun of it because I want to do a little history. Roughly in the United States, about 90 million acres of corn, about 90 million acres of soybeans. Actually, it's always a few million acres less of soybean production each year than corn, except for twice in the last in history. In 1983 and in 2018, we produced more acres of soybeans than we did corn. But in general, it's around 90 million each, okay? Within a couple million either way. You know what it was in 1983, 40 years ago? 60 million of each, roughly. We have 50%, we have 50% of our acres on corn and soybeans in 40 years. And you're saying, well, wait a minute, did we go, it's like Brazil, did we go and plow out the rainforest? No, we converted some wheat acres, first off. We converted some lesser acres. We took hybrids and technology to the Dakotas that didn't appreciably grow a lot of corn and soybeans, and now they do. We converted acres that were wheat or flax or oats or whatever to corn and soybeans because they're more profitable. But the point is, you're saying, well, Damon, why are you telling me this? Well, we just increased in 40 years roughly the acreage count on corn and soybeans by 50%. Where did that go? Did you eat more corn last year? Did you eat more corn-based products last year? Did you eat more soy-based products last year? Maybe by just a little bit. It went overseas. And my point is, this will not, given also that each year we produce about 1.9 more bushels of corn than the year prior on the trend line, and about 0.8 to 1 more bushel of soybeans each year per acre based on the trend line. It's not just 50% more acres, put 50% more acres and also the trend line of 2 bushels more corn and 1 bushel more soybeans each year. It's a shitload of corn and soybeans. Where did it go, Todd?
Well, and that's exactly right. And I think I did some recent analysis on corn, and you look at the large corn producers in the world, and you see China and the U.S. both appear on that list, right? But what gets distorted is the size of China's population. So if you break that down on a kilogram per capita basis, the U.S. produces over 1,000 kilograms of corn per capita, and China produces less than 200. So you're talking about a significant expansion, even in wheat, where, as you mentioned, some of that historical wheat production area has been lost to corn production. But even in wheat, if you look at it on a per capita basis, we produce over 150 kilograms of wheat per person in the U.S., and in China, it's less than 100. So we are significantly, punching way above our weight in terms of agriculture production. These are the staples.
Yeah, we couldn't possibly use 1/3 of what we produce.
Right, yeah. Right. And another thing, obviously, to point out is that a big chunk of that is going to fuel, in terms of the corn production. So what has happened to all that corn that we're producing now that we weren't producing before? It's a combination of exports and ethanol production.
Yeah. And the ag community, they get a little, they gulp. They had to look down like they're afraid I just said something at the dinner table that was inappropriate, which I am akin to do. When I say ethanol was a short-term solution to a long-term problem, the long-term problem of having more corn than we could possibly need. The renewable fuel standard came in. This is our 20th year, 2004. This is its 20th year. And the explicit purpose of the renewable fuel standard was to gobble up corn via ethanol because we had so much of it. And that's on top of the exports, which we are a huge exporter of corn. Hey, I want to get into some more numbers before I do that. If you're looking for numbers and you are a farmer or an agricultural professional, you probably are spending a lot of your time kicking around, not getting good data, not getting good information. You know what you should do? Go to AgVisor Pro. I'm wearing the hat right now. If you happen to be watching this on Acres TV or on YouTube, you can see I'm wearing my AgVisor Pro hat. AgVisor Pro is an app that goes on your phone. You've got your smartphone. You're on it all the time. You might be listening to this podcast right now on your smartphone. Well, guess what? Go into your app store and just find AgVisor Pro. It's a free app, okay? You put it on there, and it's a network of ag professionals with information. So all of a sudden you say, damn it, I've got these resistant weed problems in my field in Kentucky. What can I do about this? Boom. You find someone that is an expert in resistant weed eradication. And all of a sudden you connect with that person. You can even become the expert yourself. Go to AgVisor Pro. It's an app on your phone, AgVisor Pro. Information at your fingertips, shorten time and distance, And all of a sudden you become more profitable. All right, on those numbers, Todd, I just threw out the numbers about the acreage increase. And like you said, we gobbled up some of it through the ethanol. We're probably going to gobble up some with this new push for renewable diesel, but still, we are an export country. You know who else is? Canada. Canada loves the globalized ag market. But again, it only works if you look at our situation. We bring in boatloads of stuff from China, for instance, and then we say, oh, because we need them for our ag market. I say they also know that they have us over the barrel and they're using us as we're essentially their money machine. That's going to probably change. I talked about that in my most recent podcast. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're generally right. And I think, as we've talked about before, you and I have talked about, and certainly you've talked about extensively, is the agriculture economy tends to sort of run counter-cyclically to the broader economy. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a good example. And so if we just take a step back and we say, okay, who is going to be the winners and losers of deglobalization? Well, you can basically just look back and see who were the winners of globalization, winners and losers of globalization, and then the reverse of that is going to be the case. That's basically true. It's not entirely true, but it's basically true. And so if you look at the winners and losers, you look at the losers in terms of deglobalization are big companies, right? Big multinational companies who have been the winners in the globalization process because they've been able to leverage these global supply chains and take advantage of lower labor costs in certain developing countries and, basically, build and make stuff in cheap countries and sell it in expensive countries, right? And so the reverse of that is obviously a disadvantage for these, large global multinational corporate interests. But that advantage would shift over to small and medium-sized enterprises that tend to be more focused on domestic markets. And so that would shift some of that advantage. Similarly, importers would be winners in a global deglobalization. Typical importers would be, it would be advantageous because they have the production to meet their own needs. And so in a deglobalized world, so countries that are heavily dependent on exports would have a disadvantage in a deglobalized world, right? Because there's going to be less opportunities. So if you look at the U.S. in general, we're in quite a good position in a deglobalized world, right? We in general, you look at the trade deficit with China, for example, right? So we are, in general terms, are importers, right? We are consumers, not producers anymore. We used to be producers, but now we're primarily consumers.
Except on ag.
Except in agriculture. Yeah. Right, except in agriculture. And so I think in general, in terms of the U.S. economy, I think deglobalization is certainly not a bad thing and maybe a quite good thing, but it is going to have a pretty significant negative impact on agriculture. So the great news is we are more than capable of feeding ourselves and our friends. Right. The bad news is we're probably going to have fewer export opportunities, and that's going to challenge us to try to decide what are we going to do with this excess production moving forward.
And it's interesting. My most recent episode was just about the China situation, and a guy that keeps up with me on Twitter, and I said he wanted to argue. And he said, no, I'm not saying I'm arguing. Well, what are these Illinois people? My neighbors over here, they're not going to produce less. So, if China's not our country. And it was almost the same mindset of, hey, I made all this stuff, and so you got to buy it. And so it's very much that agricultural mentality. Hey, I produced the hell out of stuff. Now, where are we going with it? Well, there's no demand. And so it was that very much a thing of, because I made a bunch of stuff, somebody needs to buy it, versus maybe we should decide if there's a market, then we make it. And so that's not bad, because it means that we're doing what we do well in ag and maximizing our output per acres, et cetera. But it also, imagine if it was something else. Imagine if instead of bushels of corn, it was nuclear weapons. Hey, I made all these nuclear weapons. Now, damn it, we don't need them domestically anymore. Who will buy these? And then eventually you've got to start thinking like, oh, wait a minute. Maybe it's nefarious, whoever buys this. Maybe there's a bad outcome with this. And I know that we're not comparing apples to apples. corn and nuclear weapons, but I am saying imagine if it wasn't corn or soybeans that we're talking about, where we say, or wheat, we got all this stuff. Now somebody's got to buy it. That's been our mindset for a long time, Todd. And I've been saying to my ag crowds for a long time, remember, man, a bunch of other countries learned how to be export countries in terms of agricultural commodities also. We went from, what's your numbers you used? We're at 15 billion bushels of corn roughly, and 4.5 billion bushels of soybeans. That's up like 100% from 30 years ago. It's up 50% from 10 or 15 years. I mean, I can go through and look at the charts. I'm not off by much. It's a bunch more than we used to produce. When you take and tell the ag person this might change, then they're like, well, what the hell do I do? And I don't have that answer right now. Do you?
Well, no, and it gets back to, really what we've been talking about in terms of the population trends. This is really a dual trend here that's converging together with deglobalization and depopulation. And those two factors are really what's going to be driving the future of what agriculture looks like. And I think agriculture is unique in a lot of ways. I mean, we spend a lot of time talking about we're not quite as unique as we think we are, but agriculture is unique in a lot of ways. And one of the ways that agriculture is unique is there is a cap on your ability to consume agriculture. Right. Specifically food. There is not a theoretical limit to the amount of TVs that you can sell to a certain population.
Right.
There is not a theoretical limit to cars or, really any other consumer product. But there is only so much food you can eat. Now, granted, we are really pushing the limits here. Right? Yeah. I mean, we're doing a pretty good job of eating a lot more food than we need and so forth. But there is a biological limit. One of the things that I was doing recently for a client is trying to do some projections about food demand in China. I believe that on a calorie basis, China is approaching a plateau. If you look at the US and the UK as examples, we've been pretty much flat in terms of caloric consumption per capita in the US and the UK over the past 20 years. It's
probably starting about the year 2000. I mean, we're overweight, but we're not necessarily more percentage overweight today than we were 10 or 20 years ago. So I'm guessing that, about the year 2000, somewhere in the late 90s, 20 or so years ago, we probably hit a point where we're eating 3,000 calories a day per American or something.
Right. And so we've continued to see growth in demand because of population growth. But again, population growth is going to be is slowing down, is going away. In China, it is going away. Yeah. They shrunk for the first time last year. The government even admitted it, which is
by almost a million, is not surprising. Almost a million people, and their numbers could be skewed. So
right, for sure.
The point you're going to make is, while China starts to lose population, they might eat just a little bit better, but they're going to, in the next few years, have a plateauing of caloric intake per person per day. So again, where do those bushels go? I want to also get to the hog number, since you obviously are a livestock consultant. You used the numbers once, and it almost I didn't convert them to memory, but the trend was stuck with me. We were a net importer of pork. The United States was 20 or so years ago. Then we just ramped up our hog production, and by we're like 30 or 50% bigger of a hog producer than we were just 2 or 3 decades ago, right?
Yeah. So if you look, and I think in a lot of ways, the pork industry, both domestically and globally, is going to be a bit of a canary in the coal mine. There's through a lot of these trends. So I think we're going to be, unfortunately, I think we're going to be an early indicator of what we're going to see in some of these other commodities. So I think pork, from that perspective, I think is a good example. It's obviously a convenient example for me because that's where my expertise lies. But we were a net importer of pork in the U.S. as late as the early 1990s. Right, net importer of pork. Right, so we in different cuts and stuff like that. But a net importer of pork is as late as the early 1990s. That has ramped up significantly. So since the early 1990s, our domestic consumption of pork on a per capita basis has been relatively flat. It's obviously increased due to population increase, but the increase in per capita and total consumption tracks almost exactly with population growth. And so per capita consumption of pork in the U.S. has been pretty flat for the last really 30 years or so.
About 48, 50 pounds roughly per person.
Yeah. And so we're producing about 2% more pork every year over the same time period over the last 20 or 25 years. And so what we have now is a situation where we've gone from a net importer of pork in the early 90s to where we export about 30% of the total product we produce. And basically every additional pound of pork that we produce is going to export. So that's increasing every year. So we're increasingly reliant on exports to finance our industry.
Yeah. So by the way, I'm just roughly in my head, a 2% increase every year doesn't sound like a lot, but after about what will it take? It'll take about then 20 years that means it's a doubling effect. Is it 2%?
It doesn't take long because it's compounding, obviously, on itself. It's 2% every year, but it gets bigger every year. And so, just like you go back and figure out the interest compounding, it's the same factor.
So, by the way, when I was a kid, when every farm had hogs, the average person says, "Wait a minute, hell, I don't know hardly any hog farmers. Everybody was a hog farmer when I was a kid." Yeah, less hog farmers, but each hog farmer now has 3 quad buildings with 12,000, whatever. The facilities have gotten larger and we're making a whole bunch more pork. Again, it's because of exports. And so it's not an uncommon thought to our producers. They're going to say, "Damian, we just keep getting better at producing stuff. And so we can't sell it domestically because we've already capped out." Now the answer is exports. And so it's not that I'm calling for deglobalization. I think it's simply going to happen because we're going to have enough stuff. So there's 2 reasons they're going to happen. I guess let's get into the reasons. It's going to happen because other countries joined the corn party, right? Kazakhstan now produces corn. Obviously Ukraine was on track to be a huge producer, but then now they got wars. Other countries can produce stuff as well. Maybe not as well as us, but they can produce it also. Okay. Then there's the demand picture. If everybody keeps eating better, at some point, like you said, it's finite. I can buy 14 TVs probably. I don't know where the hell I'd put them, but I could do that. I can only eat so much food. So there's that issue. And then there's the conflict, particularly the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea axis, if you will, versus essentially all of the Western countries.
Right. And so what we're going to see here, I believe, is a shift in food quality in developed countries. So you're going to have an interest in higher quality foods. So we're going to be less concerned about quantity and more concerned about quality. Our systems are designed, our primary systems are designed for quantity. The whole commodity, what we call the commodity mindset, is all driven by a focus on total availability of food. So we're talking about quantity. I think that's going to shift in developed countries to a focus on quality. And that's a transition that not much of our industry is prepared to make. And so trying to understand how do we market higher quality products that people are willing to pay a higher margin for, because that's really our only opportunity in a deglobalized or deglobalizing economy, in an environment where we're deglobalizing and depopulating. That's really where the opportunity lies, and our systems aren't really designed to take advantage of that. So we need to be making this shift away from a quantity mindset to a quality mindset. And what that exactly means, I don't know. It'd probably be different for different commodities. In pork, there's an opportunity to appeal to higher quality in terms of maybe we've gotten the product too lean and people are looking for a higher marbled product. It may also revolve around people looking for products that are less impactful on the environment or better animal welfare, or whatever those are. Those are opportunities that we've certainly seen trends developing in that way. But those are going to go from being an opportunity to make additional margin to the only way we're going to continue to be able to survive. So that's sort of the transition period we're in right now.
I agree with that, and I've been preaching that for a long time, that eventually when you realize we have enough of whatever this thing should be, that then it becomes, let's now make better stuff. Not that any of our stuff is bad, but we'll focus on flavor versus quantity. We'll focus on nutrient density versus perishable, or transportation. Like we made tomatoes so that they hold up really well and can be trucked all around the country. The problem is they don't have any taste. There's that kind of thing. And I talked about that in my book. But what about the inputs? If a deglobalized world is embarking, happening, starting, beginning in its early stages, which I think it is, it's the inputs that I'm concerned about. We offshored for so long, and China understands that if we want manufactured goods right now, we still need them. Crop inputs. I'm not as worried about machinery. I'm generally not as worried about technology. I mean, India is going to now have a Foxconn facility making smartphones for Apple right now because Apple says, oh, crap, we've got too dependent on China for our supply. So I'm not as worried about the technology. I'm more worried about the inputs. Do you see that happening?
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting trend. And I think that's really where countries that are sort of in the middle. So if you look at middle income countries that are not self-sufficient in their own food needs.
Mexico, so again, obviously, Mexico comes to mind, top of the mind.
Yeah. Now, Mexico has a huge advantage of being right next door to the U.S. And there's a lot of potential symbiotic relationships there in North America. So, the best example, again, I know we keep going back to this, but the best example of a middle income country that is import dependent is China. And they are import dependent in a lot of ways, not just on food imports, but they're dependent on the ingredients to make the food, right? They have a tremendous capability to produce pork in China. They do not have the capability of producing enough feed to feed all of the animals. And so, right. Yes, they could theoretically become self-sufficient in pork fairly easily, right? But they're not truly self-sufficient because they require these feed inputs, primarily soybeans, but also corn, in order to be able to produce those animals. And so without those inputs, they're unable to do that. The U.S., on the other hand, are we reliant on China to produce the inputs that we need? Yes, but those are small inputs that is certainly feasible that we could either get somewhere else or develop those capabilities on our own.
Well,
and
wait,
so we have the ability.
Wait. I just want to throw in there.
We have the ability to replace some of those.
Right now, yes. The answer is it's not that it's unharnessable technology. It's not like they're genius scientists in the labs. I mean, they're good at producing stuff in labs, obviously. Look at Wuhan, but they didn't. The inert ingredients for a chemical that like our girl Lacey might sell. If they make that, it's not like they are the only place in the world that knows how to make it, is what you're saying. So like if I'm farming out here in Indiana and I need my chemicals to grow good crops, a bunch of those ingredients or even the jug itself might come from China. But your point is it's not like they held the technology to make it. We just went over there, or BASF went over there, or Bayer, whichever chemical company it was, and said, we're going to set up shop over here because there's less environmental regulations and we can get it made cheaply here. You're saying that could reshore quickly enough to make it so we don't have a hiccup?
There's going to be a hiccup. I think it's going to be a relatively small hiccup. So if you look at it, again, on the livestock side, We found out during African swine fever that we were very dependent, almost exclusively dependent on China for several micro ingredients.
Yeah.
So we had, a good example would be synthetic amino acids. So synthetic amino acids are not required, but they are required to efficiently feed animals. Some of the vitamins and trace minerals, we were very dependent on China as well. And so that was a short term is a major problem, right? But because those cannot, we have to have those ingredients, those micro ingredients. Some of those micro ingredients are required. You can't just start producing diets that are fundamentally deficient in, vitamin A or vitamin D or vitamin K. So, but none of those ingredients, there's no fundamental reason why we can't produce those ingredients ourselves or find someone that's friendlier or closer or more convenient to be able to do those. So if you start comparing that to the fundamental problems that China has in terms of feeding itself, they don't have an easy answer to buying a bunch of corn from someone that's more friendly or producing more corn themselves. They just don't have an option there. And they're also still obviously a very rich country in terms of their leverage of their population, but they're much closer on a per capita GDP basis to Mexico than they are to the U.S. So, so it's a middle income country that doesn't have the natural resources they need to fundamentally feed their own population.
Should the people that are listening to this, whether they work for a chemical company, a machinery company, whatever, farmer, we got their business-minded people. We're not saying that we're setting up for a future of squalor. De-globalization, and I guess we should almost say it's not going to be completely deglobalized. It's almost more like if you read 1984 by Orwell, where he talks about the three, it wasn't like Eurasia, East Asia, and Oceania were the three. And I think it's going to be more like that, where Europe and the United States, we culturally have a lot more in common. We're probably going to be more like that. So it's not a 100% decoupling from all global markets. It's a tighter affiliation is what I see happening. And it probably doesn't mean that we're all of a sudden going to be screwed economically in agriculture. It just means that we're going to have less of the mentality of let's make as much crap as we can and find a container ship to put it on or a grain ship to put it on. Am I right? Or am I seeing this wrong? And you're telling me, no, it means we're going to end up taking a pay cut.
Yeah, deglobalization, I think, in the transition period is going to look more like regionalization, as you mentioned. So I think so you have to start thinking about this in terms of blocks of countries that are politically, they're geographically related enough or are politically or culturally related enough to form, a block that can be self-sufficient as a block. And so you start looking at some of those, examples around the world, and North America starts looking like a really pretty decent place, right? You have Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. You pull in a couple of additional Latin American countries there, and it's not hard at all to imagine that you've got a pretty functional economic bloc there that's led by the U.S. obviously, but is tapping into some of the natural resources and human resources that Latin America has to be able to be in a pretty good position. So I think the U.S. looks pretty good. North America looks pretty good. Europe probably looks okay. But when you start looking at East Asia, it looks pretty ugly. And just in terms of the population, their ability to feed themselves and maintain economic validity with the demographic challenges that they're dealing with.
My last thought, and then this is one we should almost do a year from now or 6 months from now. And what we are calling deglobalized, like you said, it might be more regionalized. Where does India end up? Does India become our new best buddy because they don't have the communist party that wants to take over the United States the way China does?
I think India is a really interesting example. Demographically, they obviously have a huge population. They're not quite as demographically healthy as you might think they are, but they're certainly in much better position than the East Asian countries like China. So it'll be really interesting to see what happens there. I think India, to a certain degree, can determine their own destiny by deciding where they're going to align themselves. Yeah. So I think that will be something you really want to keep a close eye on. Does India align themselves with more of a Western block of countries? This is clearly Japan's strategy to align themselves with the West. If India takes more of a go it alone approach, or more of a Southeast Asian approach, or a broader Asian approach, I think that's probably negative for them. If they decide to engage more with a Western group of countries and deepen ties there strategically, militarily, and some of these other ways, they could be a beneficiary of this transition, but it depends almost exclusively on how they decide to play their cards. And it's completely unclear and a very difficult projection to make, because the political situation in India is almost indecipherable to anyone inside India, much less outside.
The benefit is that they aren't run by a autocracy controlling party like China. The bad part is that they don't have enough organization at all. The smart move, obviously, for them would say, we got 1.3 billion people. We're an ascending economy. We really should get in bed with the United States, North America, and Japan, and just boom. That way we're buffered from our aggressors to the north, meaning China and Russia. And it could end up being a very good thing. And it could be a replacement to China. And I'm not the first person to think this way. It's just that it's kind of gone away because everybody's entire focus, as you said, all for God's sakes, they've talked about when the United States agricultural complex thinks globalization, what do they think of, Todd?
China.
Yes. Get me out of here now. The future of ag is deglobalized. You and I both predicted it. We said it's not quite like we're going to all of a sudden, we're not going to build walls on both the Atlantic and Pacific coast and all across both of our north and south borders and then say, leave us alone. It's not quite like that, but it's definitely going to be a different picture 1 year from now and 5 years from now than it is right now. You said we're in the middle of it. I say we're in the first quarter, barely into the first quarter.
Yeah, I mean, we're when I said we're in the middle of it, we're in the middle of the transition, right? Yeah, the middle of the tip. So I think we're sort of at the tipping point. I think when you look back on it historically, we're going to say, like you mentioned before, the movement was in this direction. The pandemic accelerated that by accentuating some of the supply chain fragility that globalization has brought us, and so that's going to accelerate the process. So what was probably going to happen anyway, almost certainly going to happen anyway, is now sped up by 5 to 10 years, right? So I think we'll look at this as a tipping point. In a lot of ways, we've moved the schedule up significantly. So what was probably going to happen in the 2030s is probably now going to happen in the 2020s. But I think we're certainly in that transition period. And there are potential factors that could reverse that. I don't think any of them are very likely, but there are some potential factors that could reverse it. So we definitely could be wrong. If we're wrong, it's probably about the pace of the change, not the ultimate landing point. But certainly there's going to be a lot of factors here, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a transition. Some countries are positioned well enough to be able to have a little bit of a wait and see attitude. Some other countries are going to need to make quick, decisive decisions. And whether or not they're capable of doing that will have a major impact on where they end up landing in terms of the winners and losers.
So there's an old statement that if you keep up history, when trade ships cross the oceans, warships don't, or something like that. You've heard. And I honestly think that there's a little bit of validity to that, but it's not completely valid because we also have had an armed conflict every day since World War II, and the United Nations came into being and kept telling us that trade was the answer. I think there's another thing to consider, Todd. There are forces that very much do not want any deglobalization at all. And when you look at the Bill Gateses or the World Economic Forum, I'm not sure that those forces that keep telling us how good globalization is for us actually have our best interests at heart. And I would say that be careful about those that are pushing for it. Do we have markets now for pork coming out of Illinois that we didn't have before? Yep, that's good. Do we also have some other risks to our well-being and our economic well-being because of globalization? I'd say yes, we do. We are somewhat dependent, at least in the short term.
Well, I'm looking at a list of losers that I made for deglobalization, and I'm looking through that list. It includes big companies, small countries with small domestic markets, exporters, consumers, developing countries. You start looking at those players, right? And who are those? Which of those players has global influence? And the only one I see on that list is
big corporations. Huh?
Right. So yeah, that's the only powerful influence that could slow down this trend or potentially even reduce that trend. So it'll be interesting to keep a close eye on that. But the people that meet in Davos every year certainly have global influence. Whether they have enough global influence to slow the trend towards deglobalization, it'll be interesting to see. I don't think even those folks are going to prove to be powerful enough to reduce that or to reverse that trend.
It's kind of like these things are happening, and even a bunch of global influence peddlers won't be able to make that. And are you saying, by the way, are you questioning that when Bill Gates and John Kerry get together in Davos, it might be self-serving versus more their concern about the poor people in Sri Lanka?
I think that might be true.
His name's Todd Thurman. My name's Damian Mason. We host a thing called the Business of Ag Success Group every other Friday on a Zoom call with industry guests that come in and talk and have great dialogue. It's only $99 a month. You should really join. If you are in this business of agriculture, you should be in the Business of Ag Success Group. You probably, if you work for a company, they have a thing called continuing education budget. For God's sakes, give us $99 a month. We'll make you smarter and more successful. Todd, if they want to find you, Todd does speaking engagements. We've been toying around with the idea of offering ourselves as a package where you just give us 2 microphones and a stage and a subject. And if it's about the business of agriculture, we're good. It'd probably be like a convocation. It'd be like the kind of thing that, people will come in there and be like earth-shattering information, maybe not, but it'd be damned interesting. So anyway, if you want to look us up for that, you can find me. You know where to find me. Todd, if they want to find you, where do they find you?
You can find me on LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest place, or you can just go to swinetex.com, SWINETEX.com, and all my information is there.
Got it. His name's Todd Thurman. My name's Damian Mason, and this is the Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of the Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern Ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.